Hello everyone, Lexi Velica here with Memorial Theft, and today we're doing something a little bit different. As you can see, we are not at my usual setup with my desk and my journals, but instead we are on a computer and on my website, specifically my journaling page, because today we're going to talk about why I think you should make a personal site and how you can use it for journaling purposes, because of course, this is a journaling channel. I am a little bit obligated to talk about journaling to some extent in any of my videos. That's why you're here, I assume. So there's a couple of reasons why you might want to make your own website. The first of those is creative expression. There is nothing more freeing than being able to have your own little corner of the internet that you can do anything you want with. You can put all your creative work on there. You can put just shrines to your interests and things that you love. You can obviously use it for journaling, like I'm going to be talking about later. You can do pretty much anything you want with it. And it's also an excellent way to connect with other people, especially if you use a hosting platform like NeoCities, which I'll recommend later on in this video. It has slight social media type features where you can view the profile/website of other users and comment on them and reach out to them directly. There's also less worries about having to appease an algorithm and making sure that your content gets delivered to people. And it also makes sure that your older content isn't buried just because it's not new and exciting. Everything that you ever produce will be on your website in the exact order and structure that you want it to be. There's also less worries about censorship because there's no algorithm. You don't have to worry about being advertiser friendly, especially if the hosting platform you're using doesn't have ads. You can do pretty much anything you want and talk about anything you want. It's also honestly more freeing from a journaling sense or talking about your life personally kind of sense. I think it feels less embarrassing to vent on articles on my website than it would on social media because people have to actively seek out your website in order to see your content. So it doesn't feel like you're pushing your dark thoughts onto people that just happen to appear on their timeline because they had to make the choice to open up that page that has that stuff on it, which is not to say that I use my website entirely for venting purposes or anything. It's just like a side benefit that I feel when it comes to talking about personal subjects on my website. And lastly, it's just plain cool to say that you have a website, that you can just tell people that like, hey, I've got a website, you can find me on the internet at any time you want, and it's there, and it's there to stay. Hopefully. Also worth noting, you don't have to share everything, only what you want to. And the process of earnestly deciding what you want to share can be really helpful in organizing your thoughts. You do kind of have to put your thoughts and what you would journal through a little bit of a filter to decide, like, do I want people to read this? Is this fit for public consumption or not? And I think that's very helpful to process the things that are going on in your life or that you're thinking about. And on the topic of a website being an excellent creative outlet, it's also a lot easier than you think because it can be as simple as possible, just basic text on a web page, or it can be extremely elaborately designed and really creative. I have seen so many personal sites on NeoCities because NeoCities also has this amazing directory where you can find other sites that just blow me away, that are absolute wizardry behind them. And really, if you do decide to make a very simple website, there is truly no shame in a very simple, basic, quote-unquote ugly website. In fact, they work really well because they load really fast and they usually are adaptive and responsive, meaning that they can show up on a mobile device the same way that you intend really easily. So in order to build a website, you need to use 2 languages at minimum, and those languages are HTML and CSS. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and HTML is what determines the structure of a website. For example, my website here consists of these things called elements, which I'll show you what they look like in a little bit. But right here, this title that says journal is an element that is called H2, which stands for heading to. And here this text is a P element, which stands for paragraph. And basically what the HTML does is it uses a set of elements in order to delineate what content goes into what sections. It was really helpful once I realized that HTML is just sectioning out text and other content like images or videos or anything else. And later, that is arranged by the second language that we use, CSS, which stands for cascading style sheets. CSS is what informs the visual design of a web page. It's what's making this background an off-white color. It's what's giving the heading a dotted orange underline. It's what's giving these sections their own yellow dotted underline. It's what's basically deciding everything that isn't the actual content words on the page. So before we actually start writing any HTML and CSS, there's a couple things you're going to need. First off, you're going to need a host once you finish writing your files. And what I recommend using is NeoCities. So this is what NeoCities looks like when you have your own web page. This is the dashboard page that you can include all your files. Basically, how the internet and web pages work is that there is a server that contains files. It contains what the actual HTML, it contains the page that has the CSS that dictates how everything looks, as well as all the images and other content that appears on that page. And one thing that's important to note is that the main page on your website will always be called index.html. And the same goes for the main page in any folder, because when you go to my website, wolfpitmachine.neocities.org, you'll be directed to this index page. But if you were to go to wolfpitmachine.neocities.org/art, which is contained in this folder, the main page will be directed to is this folder's index.html. So that's one thing you just need to keep in mind, that the main page on your website is always going to be called index.html. And now, how do we create this index.html? Well, we're going to need to use a text editor. And there are two text editors that I recommend. I recommend Visual Studio Code, also called VS Code, and I also recommend Notepad++. I used to use Notepad++ for everything all the time, but I recently switched over to VS Code because it's just so popular. It's really often talked about in the development world, and I really understand why now, because there's a lot of built-in extension plugin things that make the workflow just generally easier, a couple of which you'll see during this demonstration. And I also just find it not a lot more user-friendly, but it's at the same level and it's just got a little bit more extra perks. You know what I mean? But I used to use Notepad++ ever since I was relatively young, and when I started dabbling in coding, I would even sometimes write stories in there, even though it's not meant for writing anything actual content in there, because it does not have spell check and the structure is nothing like a document editor. But for how to use VS Code, first you're going to go to File. You can either go to New Folder or Open Folder. I will go to Open Folder because I already created a folder for this demo on my desktop called Video Demo. I will select the folder, and then I will go to File, New Text File, select a language, and scroll down until I see HTML. Now, one thing that's really cool about VS Code is that it has some very helpful keyboard shortcuts just built in for HTML. I believe there might be some for other languages, but I'm mostly accustomed to writing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which is a third language for the web that allows you to incorporate interactivity in your websites, but that far exceeds the scope of this video. The most important thing that I like to do is use the shortcut that sets up the basic structure of an HTML document, which you can do by hitting exclamation point and enter. Now, this is what the basic structure of an HTML document looks like. First, you have this piece up here, which is called an element. An element is anything that is a keyword contained between two of these, I believe they're called caret braces. You know what? I never really figured out what they're called. I just see them and I think, oh, I'm thinking about HTML and programming languages now. Or I think about lesser than and greater than symbols, honestly. But what declares the very top that this document is an HTML document is this exclamation point doc type HTML. And then next we see what most elements come in the form of, which is elements that have a opening tag and a closing tag. You know, an element is closed because it has a backslash at the front of the element in front of the keyword. Now, this element is the HTML element, and it also has this thing called an attribute, which specifies that the language of this file is in English. And the next two elements are very important in the structure of every HTML document and website, and that is the head and the body. So the head is essentially more of like meta information and information that pertains to the website that doesn't actually appear as content on the page. For instance, we have this section here, which is most important, which is the title. And the title is the name of the web page that appears when you are on the browser, which in this instance, for this NeoCities dashboard, the title of the web page is NeoCities-dashboard. So for this demonstration, I'm just going to be calling our website demo, and I will hit Control S in order to save. And remember, we entitle our first web page as index.html. And see, the name is here, and in our folder explorer on the side, it's showing that we have the index.html file. And you can also see that these other two meta elements, which aren't really important for you to know right now, but I do recommend looking into what these mean later on if you're interested. There's going to be links in the description for a lot of different resources that I recommend for learning the basics of HTML and CSS and just anything that pertains to making websites. So let's talk about the basic elements that will determine the structure of our site. First, we're going to use an element that I talked about earlier, and that is a heading element. We're going to include an H1 element, and you can see when I type that last brace, it immediately automatically includes a closing tag for me. So I can just immediately go right on to write, welcome to my site, exclamation point, because we're very friendly here. And what's important to note is that these tags are semantic tags, which means that they dictate the meaning of the content on your page as well as their basic structure. And headings are very important because they come in many different forms. They come in H1s, H2s, H3s, H4s, and so on. This determines the level of heading on your page. And by default, they're going to be looking different. Each one will look different, and they're usually based on size and the way the font itself is styled. The general rule of thumb is to only have a single H1 title element on your page because this wants to be the main title of your page. You don't want to be having anything confusing and have multiple H1 elements because it's going to be confusing, especially for users of screen readers. It's very important that your HTML elements are accurate and descriptive because otherwise it's going to be very difficult for visually impaired users to navigate and understand your sites. But next, we're going to want some actual text content. So we're going to use a P element, which I talked about earlier is what the basic text was. And you see again, it encloses the element for me. And I'm just going to type hello world, which is the basic statements that any programming language you will learn right off the bat how to make. Even though HTML is not a programming language, it is still just generally basic that most people will make a basic hello world website at some point in their life. In order to save, again, I'm going to do Control S. And if I want to view my website, what I can do is I can go to the folder that my website is contained in with my index.html file, and I just click on it, and immediately it goes to my website. Oh, I realized I made a typo. Let's just fix that. And then I go back to my website, and I have to refresh, and there we go. So this is super, super basic, and you're going to obviously want to use more than these elements in your website. So I'm just going to cover a couple of really basic elements that you'll want to use that are for different purposes in your websites. First off, images. Lots of websites have images, and you're probably going to want to include an image of some kind in your websites. It's only natural. So for doing an image, you will do a tag elements that is img, and you're going to need to include an attribute to tell your computer what image file you want to load on the page. In order to do that, you do src, which stands for source, equals, and you see it automatically puts quotation marks because this is where I'm going to put the path to the image file that I'm going to use. And then we do a closing brace. Now you notice I did not close this element with another element that has that backslash in it. And that's because an image element is something I believe that's called a closed element or a void element, meaning that it does not have actual content that goes in between the tags. It just exists on its own. And now what we need to do is we need to find an image that we're going to use on our website. So I'm just going to go to my pictures and hope that I'm going to have to censor this because I don't want anyone to see what I have in my documents. And we're just going to use, let me find a picture that's not too awful. Let's just use my icon. So I'm going to copy this image over here. It's called sadcatfish.jpg. Close that, minimize that. And then now you see it's in the folder that my index.html file is included in. So it shows up on the file explorer on the side. So in order to get that in here, we're just going to have to type the name of the file, sadcatfish.jpg, and save. And it should appear on my website once I refresh. There we go. And you can also do a couple things, like if you want to determine what size this image is, you can do that by including a height and width attribute. And the height and width is going to be, by default, if you put in a number, determined in pixels, which refers to just the individual tiny pixel unit on your screen. So I'm going to just do a basic 100 height and 100 width. Save that. Go to my site, refresh, and see, much smaller. You can also determine the height and width of an image or an element through CSS, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Important other tags include the A tag, which is the tag for links. Now, for a link, you will have to include an href attribute, which determines what the link is pointing to. So I'll do href equals, and we get the quotation marks again, and let's just grab the URL for my website, my journaling page. We paste that link in here, and we close, and you see it's another element that contains content, so it includes a closing tag, and then we're just going to write link to my other site. Save that. And then on the demo, yep, we see the link to the other site. Now you notice that this didn't appear on a new line like that image did, or the heading and the paragraph did. And that's because some elements are considered inline elements, as in they will appear in the same line as another element, as opposed to a block element which creates its own new section. Now this is something that relates to something that's a little bit confusing about HTML and CSS called the box model. Which, if you really think about it, all the parts of the HTML layout and all of the ways that you can design and change them are really just boxes, and the boxes that contain other boxes, as you can nest these things within each other. For example, I can put a link inside of a paragraph, and that link will not disrupt the size or flow of that paragraph. It will just be contained within it. When the same thing goes, images are also inline, and they do not create new blocks or line breaks or anything. They just exist in the same realm as another elements, which I hope I'm explaining well enough. So another element that you might want to use is a ordered list or unordered list. So that you can use it by either OL for an ordered list, which means a list that has numbers, or UL for an unordered list, which is a list that has just bullet points by default. So I'm going to do a unordered list, and you get the same closing elements. And for each item on your unordered list, you will use an LI element. And this is just the content of your list, what each individual bullet point will be. So I'm just going to type 1, 2 for my next one, and 3 for my last one. And you'll notice that these are contained within the UL elements, and they are indented. It's generally best practice for any time you have something that's going to be contained inside another element to indent on subsequent lines so you can view your code in a less confusing manner generally. And I go back to my demo site and I refresh, and I see I have my bulleted list. Now another element that I'm going to talk about, which is a little bit more advanced because it doesn't really do anything by default, but is extremely important for designing your website and organizing your content is a div element. And that is a div. And there we go. A div element is, think of it like a section of content, where it is a division of content, where anything it contains is its own invisible block. It's invisible by default. It has no properties by default. It doesn't do anything. And you can put anything you want in there, like you can put some text in there, or you can even put another div element. But let's save that, and we will open up and we will see that we just added the P element as if there was no div surrounding it. It's just on its own, and we wouldn't know that there was a div in the first place unless we actually looked at the code. So in order to connect your styles, in order to do CSS, you need to either do a style elements where you can put your CSS in here, or you can link a style sheet. In order to do that, in the head tag, both of these have to be done in the head tag, you can do a link element with the rel for relationship attribute of style sheets. I'm having a hard time typing today. And then the href attribute, which we know as the direction for a link based on the a element, for the name of your style sheet, which I usually name as style.css. And we save that, and it hasn't changed anything on our demo site, as you can see. It just looks the same as it is. But since we don't have a file for style.css, it's not linking to anything, so we'll have to make a new file for that. So we'll go to new text file, select a language, we'll go to CSS. So CSS is different syntactically from HTML, and it is determined by using something called selectors. And that determines what you're choosing to add visual information and styles to. So for example, we are going to, let's change the font for our paragraph element. So in order to do that, our paragraph element is shortened to as a P. So we will type P, and we use a curly brace, which you see is automatically closed for me, and then create a new line. And we're going to in order to change the font for this, we will use a property called font family. And you can see that it's the autocomplete here is showing examples of different fonts we can use. In order to figure out what are the exact values you can do for a property, I advise looking it up on W3 Schools. It can tell you all the information we're going to do. But how font family works is you use the name of the font. Let's pick this one. We'll use the name of the font or multiple fonts, and then it will give you the generic name for that font. For example, we're using Arial, and if the user that opens our website does not have Arial installed on their computer, then it'll check to see if they have Helvetica installed on their computer. And if they don't, it'll just use whatever sans serif font they have on their computer. And sans serif means it doesn't have those little lines at the end of different parts of the font, if you didn't know. So if we save that, we have to name it as style.css. And we should, when we refresh our demo, see, the font is now a sans serif font. It's likely Arial because I definitely have Arial installed on my computer. And now we can do this for a lot of different things. If we want to change the background color of the page, we can select the body elements by typing body, do curly braces, and then we choose background color. Let's do, not blue because it's hard to see. Let's do aqua. Now you can write out the name of certain colors by a set of keywords, but another cool thing about VS Code is if you hover over the name of the color or the little square that appears, gives you the preview of what that color looks like, it opens up this color picker where you can just choose precisely what color you want to use. And it interprets it in this format of this function that's called RGB, standing for red, green, blue, and it gives a numeric value for each amount of red, green, and blue that's going to be used. You can also use a numbering system for picking colors called hex code, which is a pound or hashtag symbol followed by 6 value digits that can be either letters or numbers. And it's based on a system of numbers called hexadecimal, which is a little bit confusing to understand. But usually if you color pick a color in a graphic manipulation program, you can allow it to show you what the hex code for that is, and you can copy and paste that directly into your documents. Or you can just Google, if anything you want, that's like color name hex code, and you'll find hex codes for that color. Or you can just do it the basic way that I just showed you. But anyways, let's look at our website, and we will see when we refresh that our background is now this nice blue color. And you can select basically any elements with this system. And you can even be more precise than this by adding something called classes or IDs to your HTML. In order to do that, you see how we have these attributes like the href and the source attribute? Well, what we can do is add another attribute that's called class, and let's just name this box. And we save that. And in order to select, instead of just all divs on our page, but that box in particular, so let me demonstrate this by adding another div that doesn't have that. Saving. In order to select just this div that has the class box instead of this div, we can go to our CSS and do dot box. The dot is the indication that we are targeting a class instead of a name of an element. And if you want to select an ID, which IDs are the same thing as classes, except you can only have one ID for one element on a page. If you use the same code name for as an ID for multiple elements, you might have some unexpected results in your code. But a class can be applied to many different elements, and you can have as many classes as you want on an element. So in order to select this just one div, I use the dot box selector, and I'm going to add a border of 1 pix width and a solid border instead of a dashed or a dotted border, and I'm going to make it black. And I'm going to save. And when we open up our website and refresh, we see that this div now has a border, but this one doesn't. And if we just use the selector of div, it would target both of them, and both of them would have the border. But instead, we targeted it by the class, and it just has, only this one has that border. A couple other really basic CSS properties worth knowing is text align. And text align can have multiple different values of like center, end, justify, left, right, as well as some other ones you see here. But like if you want to center text, this is the easiest way to center text. See, and it centered all the paragraph elements on our web page. But if you want to center something like a block element, like a div, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And I honestly don't know how to do it reliably all the time. And one of the most common things that I'll have to Google search while making a website is how to center a div. And honestly, the most important part of web design and making your website is learning the language of what to Google. And that's why I suggest looking up tutorials beyond this one or other web resources, so you have the basic language and you know what problems you need to solve, so you know exactly what to type in your Google searches. So another important relevance property I want to talk about with CSS is you notice that in this div here, that the text doesn't really have much space in between the top and the bottom of it. What we can do is add something called padding. And we do this with the property padding. And property padding is technically a shorthand for padding left, padding right, padding top, padding bottom. It's in a little bit different order than that. I can't really remember the order it's in all the time. I always have to look it up. But if you just include one value, it applies the padding to all directions of the element, because CSS uses something that I think I mentioned earlier called the box model. So for here, though, for demonstration purposes, I am including 40 pixels as the size of it. And when we open and refresh our site, we see there's a lot more space on the ends of the P elements. Now, the box model is best explained visually. This is W3 Schools, which is the best resource I recommend for learning in a beginner-friendly way the basic syntax and things about CSS. and HTML. You see that our content here is in the middle, followed by the padding. Now the padding, an important thing to know is that if you change the background color of an element, the padding will also be included in that background color. So it is part of the element itself. And on the very edge of the element is the border, like that we saw here, that this is the border is going around the end of the padding. But past that is something called the margin, which is the space in between elements after an element. And you can change that to make there to be extra space in between. Let's say we want more space between the unordered list and this div element with the border. We would add margin, let's say 40. And when we reload our website, well, that was an unexpected outcome. It added more space here, but it did not add more space here like I thought it would. I wonder why that happened. This is something that happens a lot when it comes to working with HTML and CSS. You change a property, a property's value, or you change something, and things don't really happen exactly as you expected them to. And you just kind of have to tweak with things, mess the things around, and just figure out what happened. A really helpful method of figuring out why things are working the way they are is adding borders to things and just changing the color of different elements to figure out what exactly is happening. Another important thing to note is the background color will change the background of an element, but if you want to actually change the color of your font or your text, you will have to use the color property. And I'm just going to change the color to blue, and I'm going to make it a little bit of a darker blue so we can still see it. I'm going to save, and I refresh, and you see the text is now a darker blue. Now there's a lot more properties than just the ones I'm talking about, but you will have to dig through documentation on other videos to get a more broader understanding of what kind of things you can do with HTML and CSS. This is just a basic starting ground point that you can figure out what the basic style and syntax looks like before you dive further. But it really isn't that complicated, and you can build super basic websites with using these few elements and few CSS properties. It doesn't really take that much unless you want to do things like building more complicated layouts and designs. I mean, my own website is not all that complicated. I built it before I learned too much about how HTML and CSS works. I do plan on redesigning my website at some point, but as it is, it's very functional and it serves its proper purpose. Now, one helpful thing to do to get inspiration and just figure out how websites on the web work is using something that you can do in Google Chrome. I think you can do it in other browsers, but I personally use Google Chrome, is you can inspect a website. And by doing that, to do that, you will right click and hit inspect. See, and inspect brings up this very complicated side panel here, and you can see the box model here, which will tell me exactly how much, what size the content is, how much padding it has, if it has a border and the margin. But it shows you the HTML and the styles that are applied to what you're looking at. Now it's arranged, like I said, a little bit confusingly, so it's going to take a little bit of fiddling to figure out exactly how to view things the proper way to understand what's going on. But you can just open up each of these sections here and see exactly what is going on in each element. So you see I have a main element here, and then I have a section here that has a class of listings. And each of these journal entries is a div that has a class of entry. I can just open that up and I can see each of the individual things, and it gets highlighted as I hover over them. So you can see exactly what elements are used to create what things on the page, and it really helps you understand how websites are constructed, and it gives you ideas on how you might be able to do things on your own. And like I said, you can see the styles that are applied on the different elements on over here. We can see, since we have the entry div selected, that the entry has a border of 0.5 pixels that is dashed and has a variable color of accent 3. Variables are also something you can do in CSS. It's very helpful to, at the beginning of your document, declare that certain keywords mean certain colors, so you don't have to type out the same hex codes over and over again. And these are examples of hex codes, as you can see what I'm hovering over right here. So, and like I said, the most important thing in learning how to learn about web design and making your own website is truly figuring out what kind of things to search on Google. And what I recommend to get the language on figuring out what to search is going through a documentation resource like W3 Schools, or you can also use MDN, but I find it's a little more confusingly laid out for beginners. And you can go to either the HTML or CSS tab, and you will find an introduction for each of the languages that will tell you what the very bare bone basics. And you can go through each of the sections, or you can just only look up the section you're trying to figure out how to do something. What I honestly suggest when it comes to building your own website is download the text editor and set up the basic document and just tell yourself, I'm going to make a website. I want my website to have this kind of content. I want it to say these kind of things. So I'm going to figure out how to do that. And you just kind of search bit by bit once you know the basic syntax. How do I make a section? How do I change the heights of lines of text? How do I center a div? How do I make an image clickable? How do I change the little icon that appears in the top tab of a web page? You just figure out what kind of things you want to do, and you get the basic bare bone language you need in order to make efficient and effective Google searches, and you just search and figure it out. It seems really frustrating for me to tell you this, but it's honestly the proper way to do things and how I learned web design and web development. There's a couple other resources I also use that I'll also link in the description, most notably Free Code Camp, that has these excellent exercises that do kind of hold your hand a little bit, but it walks you through exercises and teaches you the basic syntax of HTML and CSS. And I also use something that's a little bit more advanced. It's called the Odin Project, which is mostly geared towards people who want to learn front-end development, which includes JavaScript and other parts of interactivity that's for the front end of a website. And by front end, I mean the end that the user sees on their browser, not the servers and the databases that are in the back ends. And that just about concludes our little introductory tutorial on why I think you should make and how to start making your own personal website. This is a very ugly website. Your website, even if you're a beginner, will obviously not look like this. This is just for demonstration purposes. But you can genuinely create wonderful things, and it is super powerful to even doing basic things to create a text file, and then you open it up in a browser, and then you see it in your own browser. And if I wanted to upload this file to my website in order to make it visible on my website, all I would have to do is just go to my NeoCities dashboard and hit upload file. I'm not going to do it because I don't want to mess with the fact I own current index on my webpage, and I don't want this website page to be inexplicably on my own website. But that's how you would do it, and then you would be able to go to your website name on NeoCities and find your websites. So I hope that this video inspires at least one of you out there to create your own website. If you do, please link your site in the description, or not description. Please link the site in the comments if you can, or email it to me. I would really love to see it. That's all for today. Feel free to do the YouTube things if you want to, and I will see you guys some other time. Bye.